He was broken, limping, and sold for just $1. No one saw his worth until an old man with nothing left to lose raised his hand and changed everything. The county fairgrounds hadn't seen rain in weeks, and the dust that rose from the packed earth seemed to linger in the air like an old ghost. It clung to boots, to denim, to lungs, and most of all, to the tired voices of those who had come not to buy but to watch. By the time the announcer called for Lot 78, the crowd had grown restless, weary from the heat, and unimpressed by the morning's parade of horses, most of them barely more than average. The horse that stepped into the ring next didn't change their minds. He was limping before he even reached the center. His coat was a dull grayish brown, nearly the color of the dirt itself, and caked in dried sweat and mud. His left hind leg dragged slightly, and each step he took sounded more like apology than presence. His ribs were visible through the dust, a stark map of neglect that told a story no one seemed interested in reading. Someone near the front chuckled. "Should have brought a wheelbarrow for that one," a voice said. Laughter followed, not cruel exactly, just casual, careless, the kind that surfaces when people witness something too broken to matter. The auctioneer hesitated a beat longer than usual before lifting the microphone. "All right, folks," he drawled, adjusting his cap. "We got Lot 78 here. Gelding, about 7 years old, no papers, no history, starting bid, $1. That brought more laughter, louder this time. $1 was more insult than offer, but amid the clamor, a figure shifted near the back of the crowd. Walter Briggs leaned against a fence post, one hand resting on the brim of his sun-bleached hat, the other tucked deep into the pocket of a jacket too heavy for the weather. His face was a map of years, creases around the eye's skin that had seen every kind of weather, in a stillness that didn't ask for attention. Most people didn't recognize him. Those who did remembered fragments, how he used to run one of the best horse training outfits in the region, how he could gentle a wild Mustang without raising his voice. They also remembered the fire that destroyed his barn, the slow collapse of his marriage, the son who left without a word and never returned. But Walter wasn't thinking of any of that as he watched the gelding in the ring. He wasn't focused on the limp or the dull coat. He looked into the animal's eyes, low-set, cautious, but not panicked. There was no fight left in the horse, but there was no surrender either. What Walter saw was something quieter, not wildness, not defiance, just a flicker of something that had once been proud, now buried beneath too many long days and not enough kindness. And for reasons he didn't entirely understand, Walter raised his hand. $1, he said, voice steady, calm. The auctioneer blinked. "We've got one," he said, scanning the crowd. "Do I hear two?" No one moved. "Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back." There was a mix of snickers and murmurs as the gavel came down. Someone muttered, "Ought to pay him to take it." Walter ignored them all. He moved slowly without urgency or shame, making his way toward the wrangler who held the lead rope. The younger man looked uncertain, almost embarrassed, handing over the rope as if to say, "You sure?" Walter simply nodded. The horse didn't resist. He stood still, heavy and quiet, as Walter took the lead and turned toward the exit gate. They walked slowly across the gravel lot, a strange pair, one bent by age, the other by hardship, neither in a hurry. Walter's trailer sat alone at the far end of the grounds, old and rusting, the back gate down and waiting. As they approached, the gelding's hooves made soft, uneven clicks on the gravel. The limp was more pronounced now, but Walter didn't rush him. "Come on," he said softly. "It's not far." When they reached the trailer, Walter paused and looked the horse in the eye. "I'm going to call you Echo," he said, "because maybe that's what you are. A sound from something that used to be whole." Echo blinked once. Then slowly, hesitantly, he stepped up the ramp. The drive home was quiet. Walter didn't turn on the radio. He didn't talk. He simply watched the road unravel ahead, dust trailing behind in the side mirrors. The windows were rolled down halfway, letting in the scent of dry fields and long memories. The landscape rolled past in familiar patterns, fields of golden grass, skeletal barns leaning toward the wind fence lines that had seen better decades. And finally, just before the horizon dipped into shadow, the road curved toward the place he had once called a ranch. The sign was gone, and most of the buildings had been stripped by time. What remained was a single barn half sagging and a house that stood not with pride, but because no one had yet bothered to knock it down. The windmill still creaked in the distance, its blades rusted into stasis. Walter parked the truck beside the barn and stepped out. He moved slower than he used to, knees stiff from old injuries, back a little hunched. But his hands were sure as he lowered the trailer ramp and let Echo step out into the fading light. The horse paused at the edge of the ramp, then stepped down. Walter led him to the old stable, opening a stall that hadn't seen a resident in years. He laid down clean straw and filled a bucket with fresh water from the well pump. Then he stood by the stall gate watching. "You can rest now," he murmured. "No one's asking anything of you." Not yet. That night, he sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee and listened to the soft sounds of Echo shifting in the stall. The stars above were faint, distant, the way stars always are in places where there's more silence than light. Walter looked up at them for a long time, not expecting answers, just appreciating that they were still there. He hadn't meant to buy a horse that day. He hadn't meant to do much of anything. But Echo had reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not even nostalgia. Something smaller, more dangerous. Hope. He thought about Spur, his last real companion, a Mustang with a spirit that couldn't be broken and a heart that couldn't be tamed. He thought about how they used to ride the hills without speaking, understanding each other without needing to. Spur had died the winter after his son left, and Walter hadn't ridden since. He hadn't realized until Echo how much he missed being known by something that didn't need words. The next morning, before the first light touched the horizon, Walter was back at the barn. Echo stood still watching as he opened the stall gate. "I don't know what they did to you," Walter said, pouring oats into a tin bucket, "but it stops here." The horse didn't respond. He simply looked at Walter with the quiet patience of the broken, not afraid, but not yet ready. Walter took his time. He didn't reach out, didn't demand. He sat nearby on an overturned crate and talked about nothing. The weather, the crops, the way the barn used to smell in summer. Echo didn't move much, but he listened. Sometimes that was enough. By midday, Walter had cleared out the old tack room, brushed the dust off an old bridle, and repaired a stall door that had been hanging crooked for years. The work made his joints ache, but there was satisfaction in it. It was the first time in a long while the place had felt like it had a future. As the sun dipped below the trees and shadows grew long across the pasture, Walter stood by the barn gate and looked back at Echo. The gelding stood quietly in his stall, head low but his ears pricked forward as Walter whispered, "We're both still here, aren't we?" No answer came, but none was needed. Echo blinked slowly, and in that simple gesture, something began. Not a bond, not yet, but the faintest sound of one forming an echo, of trust, of resilience, of a story not yet done. And for Walter Briggs, that was enough to begin again. Part 2. The Echo Within Rewrite. The mornings on the Briggs Ranch came slowly now, edged with the silence of places long left behind. Sunlight broke across the sagging fence lines and fell in dusty angles through warped stable boards. The air smelled of dry hay, old wood, and something like memory, faint, lingering, and always just out of reach. Walter Briggs had lived with that kind of silence for years, the kind that stretches long between words and longer between reasons to speak them. Each day he rose before the sun reached over the hills, his knees stiff and his back aching, but his steps steady. The ranch might not have had much left, but what remained still deserved to be tended. And now, for the first time in a long while, something waited for him at the barn. Echo. The horse didn't greet him with the eager nicker of a well-bonded companion. He didn't rush the gate or stamp impatiently at the sound of oats. But he watched, eyes still and cautious, the way a man watches a stranger on his porch. Not fearful, not yet trusting, just observant. Walter took his time. He didn't try to brush Echo on the first day or even the second. Instead, he sat near the stall on an old wooden crate with a creaky leg, sipping his coffee and speaking in the low, even voice of a man who didn't mind being ignored. He talked about the forecast, the weeds along the south fence, the smell of coyotes at night. Nothing important, nothing invasive, just sounds steady and non-threatening. By the fourth morning, Echo took a step toward him when he entered the barn. It wasn't much, but it was more than Walter expected. In the quiet moments between chores, Walter began to clean out the old tack room. He pulled tarps off saddles long unused and wiped dust from bits and bridles that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Everything bore the mark of time, cracked leather, rusted buckles, faded initials. Some of them he recognized as his own. Others had belonged to his late wife, Emily. Her side of the tack room had remained untouched since she died, a kind of quiet shrine that neither moth nor man dared to disturb. But now he found himself running his fingers along the edges of her old saddle, remembering how she used to laugh when the stirrups didn't line up, and how she'd ride with her heels too high, stubbornly ignoring every piece of advice he offered. "She would have liked you," Walter said aloud one evening as he stood beside Echo's stall. "You've got that same look she had when someone tried to fix her." Echo shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but present. Walter began to notice other small changes too. The limp remained, but Echo bore weight more evenly now, favoring his leg less with each passing day. His appetite returned gradually, first with hesitation, then with increasing certainty. His coat started to shine dull gray, giving way to something warmer beneath the layers of grime. What had entered Walter's life as a ghost was becoming a horse again, piece by piece. And Walter, whether he wanted to admit it or not, was becoming something else too. The routines that once felt hollow were now markers of progress. Each bucket of clean water, each flake of hay, each stroke of a grooming brush was a quiet promise made and kept. Echo never gave in easily, but he didn't pull away either. He stood still beneath Walter's hands, muscles tense, eyes watchful. Yet with time he began to lower his head a little. He began to close his eyes, if only for a moment. In the evenings, Walter would pull a folding chair out to the porch and play his old guitar strings, half rusted and out of tune. The music didn't fill the air so much as hum through it, soft and wavering. It had been years since he'd played anything, not since Emily passed, and certainly not since Mark left. But his fingers remembered, even if his voice didn't. He sang sometimes low and broken, the way a man does when he knows no one's listening, or when he's singing only for the dead. He'd glance toward the barn occasionally, and more often than not find Echo standing near the stall window, head turned in his direction. "You don't know the words, huh?" Walter would ask, strumming idly. "Neither do I." There was something sacred in the silence that followed. One afternoon, after the chores were done and the tools had been hung back in place, Walter found himself sitting outside the stall brushing Echo's mane. It was the first time he'd done it without gloves. The bristles moved slowly through tangled strands, and the horse stood still, eyes half-lidded, as if the world had narrowed down to that one small act of care. Without quite meaning to, Walter spoke. Mark was 8 when he got his first pony. Named her Molly. She was meaner than a sack of rattlesnakes and twice as fast. He paused, remembering. He'd come home with bruises on his shins, dirt in his teeth, and the biggest damn smile I'd ever seen. Echo flicked an ear. Then we lost Emily. He was 17. We started arguing about everything. He thought I was trying to control him. I thought he was throwing his life away. One night he left. Didn't say goodbye, just gone. Walter's hand stopped for a moment, resting lightly on Echo's withers. I didn't go after him. Told myself he needed space, but the truth is I didn't know how to reach him anymore. The horse didn't move. Walter continued brushing. That's when the barn fire happened. Lost half the roof. Lost Spur too. My last good horse. After that, the place just stopped. The weight of it hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Not just the story of a lost son or a burned barn, but of time left unwatched and grief left untended. But that was changing now, slowly. The next morning, Walter led Echo out into the round pen for the first time. It wasn't dramatic. There was no saddle, no halter, just a rope draped loosely over his neck, and Walter's presence at the center. He didn't issue commands. He didn't crack a whip. He walked. He turned. He waited. Echo circled. At first cautiously, hooves sinking softly into the sand, then more steadily. He didn't bolt. He didn't panic. And after a few slow laps, he turned inward, stopping at Walter's side, head low. Walter exhaled like a man who hadn't breathed properly in years. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the start." He didn't mount him. Not yet. That would come later, maybe, if Echo was willing. But for now, it was enough to stand side by side. As the sun dipped below the tree line, throwing amber light across the yard, Walter stood at the edge of the round pen arms, folded, watching the horse he'd brought home for $1 find his legs again. The past hadn't changed. The regrets hadn't vanished. But they no longer held him hostage. There was something bigger now. Not redemption. Not yet. But the feeling that it was possible. That night, Walter left the barn door open a crack, just enough for the wind to pass through and the sound of breathing to travel between walls. For the first time in years, both horse and man slept without feeling completely alone. The early spring winds carried the scent of new growth across the Briggs ranch. Grass was greening along the fence lines. Buds whispered their intentions on the old pear tree beside the house. Birds had returned, nesting in the eaves, their songs tentative but hopeful. Walter Briggs noticed it all in fragments between the rhythm of brushing Echo's coat, the creak of saddle leather being oiled, and the steady breathing of the horse beside him. Echo had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that Walter could feel it like a warmth returning to a once-cold room. The limp that once made every step a burden had softened into a minor hitch, barely noticeable except in long stretches. Echo, still startled at sudden movements, still braced when a gate swung too fast, but he no longer lived in the shadow of fear. He responded to Walter's voice with an ease that couldn't be taught, only earned. Trust had taken root. Walter had changed too, in ways he didn't speak aloud. He'd started sleeping with the window cracked open just to hear the soft sounds of the barn at night. He found himself talking more, sometimes to Echo, sometimes to the sky, often to memories he could no longer outrun. There was a slow unfreezing inside him, a loosening of the walls he'd built around his life. And then one morning, a sound not heard in years rolled across the gravel drive, tires on rock, deliberate, slow, unfamiliar. Walter looked up from where he was refilling the water trough. A black pickup truck, newer than anything he'd seen in town, came into view. It stopped in front of the house. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, dressed in worn jeans and a gray flannel shirt. He paused before walking forward, as if trying to gather years into a single breath. "Hey, Dad." Walter didn't move. The water bucket in his hands hung halfway between earth and purpose. He stared, not in disbelief, but in the kind of quiet that follows the recognition of something long hoped for, long abandoned. "Mark," he said. 12 years had passed since Walter last saw his son. 12 years since their voices had cracked through a barn full of anger and grief. Since Mark had walked away into the night, leaving silence in his place. In that moment, standing between the old house and the half-mended fence line, neither of them moved toward the other. The distance was too dense for words, but neither of them turned away. "I heard you bought a horse," Mark said, offering a half-smile. "A friend at the auction told me you looked like hell and walked out with something that looked worse." Walter squinted. He wasn't wrong. They didn't laugh, but the lines softened the edges of the space between them. "You hungry?" Walter asked after a beat. Mark nodded. "Always." The kitchen smelled of old wood and boiled coffee. Walter reheated a pot of stew that had lasted 3 days too long and set out 2 chip bowls. They ate in near silence, the kind that wasn't cold, just unfamiliar. Mark glanced around between spoonfuls. "Place hasn't changed." "It has," Walter replied. "You just remember it before it got quiet." They spoke in fragments. Mark offered stories from the years in between ranches out west, truck beds under the stars, horses, gentled horses lost. Walter listened more than he asked. When he did speak, it was mostly of practical things: fencing schedules, crop rotation, how the generator in the shed still needed replacing. But when Echo came up, everything slowed. "He doesn't make noise unless he has to," Walter said, voice low. "I think that's why I like him." Mark nodded. "I'd like to meet him." They went out to the barn at dusk. The light cut through the slats in long lines, catching dust and straw and golden drift. Echo stood in his stall, ears forward but not alarmed. He looked at Mark the way he had once looked at Walter, cautious, assessing. Mark approached slowly, his steps measured, then extended a hand. Echo sniffed it, blinked, and stood still. "He's got more strength left than I expected," Mark said softly. "He didn't start that way," Walter replied. "Took time. He trusts you. He chose to." That night, Mark stayed in the old guest room. The sheets smelled faintly of mothballs and the frame creaked with every breath. But he didn't complain. He rose early like his father, and by the second morning they fell into rhythm. Two men bound not by nostalgia, but by work. Mark helped clean out the shed-sorted nails by hand, replaced rotting boards on the south fence. Walter watched him sometimes when he thought Mark wasn't looking. The boy who had once tried to outride his pain had returned a man who had learned to live with it. They didn't speak of the past much, not directly, but some nights when the dishes were done and the porch light buzzed gently above their heads, they let the silence between them stretch and settle. One evening after Echo had been turned out to graze and the sun slid low beyond the hills, Mark said, "I used to dream of this place after I left. Some nights I'd wake up and still smell the cedar in the barn." Walter sipped his coffee, and then I'd roll over and pretend it didn't matter. The truth hung there, not accusatory, not even painful, just real. The next day, Mark brought out a flyer. Spring County Horse Show 2 weeks out. He placed it on the kitchen table between them. "You should enter him." Walter shook his head. "He's not for showing." Mark leaned back. "Then do it for the story." Walter stared at him. "What story?" "The one about a man who didn't give up, on himself, or on a horse that looked finished." Walter didn't answer, but he didn't throw the flyer away either. The following morning, he led Echo into the round pen. Mark watched from the gate as Walter guided the gelding in slow circles. No saddle, no bridle, just touch and trust. Echo responded with quiet grace. There was no flinch when Walter raised his hand, no hesitation in his gait. He stopped on a breath, turned on a whisper. "Damn," Mark murmured. "I didn't rush him," Walter said, not turning. "Didn't have it in me." Maybe that's what made the difference. Together over the next week, they trained him, gently, methodically. Mark added exercises he'd learned out west, plastic bags tied to poles, wooden bridges, strange surfaces. Echo was wary at first, but he adjusted. He adapted. He overcame. Every hesitation, every small victory became a shared triumph. One afternoon, after a particularly smooth session, Mark swung into the saddle. He didn't do it casually. He asked first soft words, gentle motion. Echo stiffened beneath him, then relaxed. Walter stood by the gate, arms folded, saying nothing. But in his eyes was the flicker of something pride-shaped. "You could show him," Walter said that night as they closed up the barn. "I could," Mark replied, "but I'd rather stand beside you if you change your mind." The flyer still sat on the kitchen table, now slightly curled at the corners. The choice lingered in the house like wood smoke, quiet, persistent. Then one morning, with fog still curling low over the pasture, Walter walked out with 2 lead ropes. Mark was tossing hay into the trough. "If you think he's ready," Walter said, "we'll go." Mark looked up, blinking against the morning sun. "He's ready." They didn't say anything else, but it was enough. The barn door opened wide that morning. The path ahead still uncertain, but the men who walked it, one old one returned, did so with a shared purpose neither had known in years. Echo stood at the gate, framed in light, waiting, and the work ahead no longer felt like work. It felt like beginning. The day of the Spring County Horse Show arrived, wrapped in early light and promise. Dawn moved gently across the Briggs Ranch, brushing the tops of the fences with gold and sending long shadows into the barn where Walter stood in silence. Echo stood beside him, already brushed and saddled, calm in the stillness. The barn smelled of old leather and hay dust, but there was a new energy humming beneath the morning quiet, one that neither man nor horse had felt in a long time. Mark stepped into the barn with 2 travel mugs of coffee and handed one to his father without a word. For a moment, they both looked at Echo, who shifted his weight and flicked his ears, but showed no sign of distress. The trust between horse and man had matured into something unspoken yet solid, the kind of trust that only grows when neither party has anything left to prove. "He's ready," Mark said quietly. Walter didn't respond right away. He simply reached out and laid a hand on Echo's shoulder, feeling the strength beneath his palm. The tremble that had once run through the gelding's body was gone. What remained was steadiness, readiness. The drive to the fairgrounds took a little under an hour. The trailer bumped along back roads as the sky bloomed brighter with each passing mile. Walter drove, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind traveling elsewhere, to the sound of hooves in empty barns, to the creak of saddle leather, to the crackling silence between fathers and sons. Beside him, Mark watched the trees blur past, his hand resting lightly on the door handle, as if grounding himself for something larger than a competition. The fairgrounds were already alive when they arrived. Children darted between booths, the air rich with the scent of fried dough and popcorn. Horses shifted in their trailers, hooves clattering, tails swishing. Announcements echoed from tinny loudspeakers and banners rippled above wooden fences in the breeze. But Walter saw none of that at first. He only saw the arena. It was larger than he remembered, ringed with wooden rails and lined with weathered bleachers, filled with families and ranchers, neighbors, and strangers. Some had come to win, others to watch, but none of them knew what this day meant for the two men and one horse standing quietly in the shadow of the trailer. They unloaded Echo slowly. He stepped down without hesitation, his eyes alert, but not frantic. Mark led him in a wide arc around the lot, letting him take in the smells and sounds. Echo didn't shy. He didn't stop. He walked like he belonged. Walter stood a little apart watching. He had once dreamed of shows and ribbons of applause and headlines. But today he wanted none of that. Today he just wanted Echo to be seen, not as a project, not as a redemption story, but as a creature who had survived and learned to trust again. When it came time for their event, Mark led Echo into the warm-up circle. Riders were already taking their turns. Young women on sleek quarter horses, old ranchers on steady geldings, a handful of local teens with borrowed mounts. The trail course was deceptively simple: open a gatewalk, over a bridge, navigate a line of poles, back up between cones, stand still for 10 seconds. But what mattered wasn't performance, it was presence, composure, connection. Walter stood at the edge of the ring, hands resting on the rail. His heart beat quietly beneath his coat, not with nerves, but with something slower and deeper, like reverence. The announcer called their names: Mark Briggs riding Echo entry, number 23. A few heads turned. Most didn't recognize them. That was fine. Mark guided Echo to the gate first. The gelding stopped, ears twitching slightly, then waited. Mark leaned forward, unlatched the gate with one hand, while nudging Echo sideways with the other. The movement was smooth, unhurried. The gate swung open, then shut again behind them. The bridge came next. Walter held his breath. The wooden slats had a habit of creaking loudly, and many horses balked at them. Echo paused at the edge, nostrils flaring, head slightly raised. Mark didn't pull. He didn't speak. He simply relaxed his shoulders, loosened the reins, and let the horse think. After a moment, Echo stepped forward. One hoof, then another. The wood groaned, but Echo crossed. The poles and cones passed without error. Echo moved like he had always known how deliberate, aware, centered. At the end of the course, they stood still. 10 seconds. The world seemed to hush. Then came the applause. Modest, not wild, but real. Walter felt it all settle into his chest: the weight of years, the ache of lost time, the awe of what they had rebuilt, not just in the horse, but in themselves. Mark rode Echo back toward the trailer while the judges tallied scores. Walter met them halfway, his hand coming up to rest on Echo's neck. They didn't speak for a moment. The horse chewed on his bit tail, swishing gently, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "You made him whole," Mark said softly. Walter shook his head. "No, he made us whole. They didn't win. A girl no older than 16 took first place with a glossy palomino and a sparkling smile. But it didn't matter. Echo had done what no ribbon could validate. He had shown himself entirely and honestly, and Walter knew in his bones that it was enough." That evening, they loaded the trailer in golden light. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fairgrounds. As they secured the doors, Walter handed Mark a small folded cloth. Mark unwrapped it to find an old brass spur, weathered smooth along the edges and polished by years of use. "It was your grandfather's," Walter said. "He used to say you can't lead with pressure if you don't also offer release." Mark looked down at it, then up at his father. There was nothing left to say. That night, as stars surfaced across the sky and the truck rumbled over the back roads, the silence between them wasn't tense. It was full, lived in, comfortable. A week later, Walter found an envelope on the porch bench. Inside was a letter written in Mark's familiar slanted hand. Echo crossed the river like he owned it. First day out, worked every other mount. "You were right. He wasn't broken, just waiting for the right hand. I think maybe I was too. Tell the fence it'll get mended when I get back." Walter read it twice, then again. He set it down beside his coffee and looked out toward the corral, now quiet again. The grass shifted in the breeze. Somewhere in the stillness, he thought he could hear hoofbeats, not loud, just the ghost of them. That night, Walter sat on the porch and watched the moon climb over the trees. He didn't sing. He didn't speak. He just listened. In Montana, Mark sat beside a fire journal in his lap, Echo tethered nearby. Other cowboys laughed and shared stories, but Mark sat quietly, one hand resting on the old spur in the dirt beside him. He didn't know where the next trail would lead, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the answer. Because he knew now that sometimes you don't find the horse. Sometimes the horse finds you, and sometimes if you're lucky enough to listen, he brings you home. The story of Walter Briggs, his son Mark, and a forgotten horse named Echo is not just about redemption. It is about the quiet, difficult work of healing. It is about how something broken can still be beautiful and how the pieces of the past can be rearranged into something whole. Walter, a man burdened by time loss and silence, had long since given up on connection. His ranch had grown as empty as the spaces in his heart, and yet something in the eyes of a worn, limping horse stirred in him the courage to try again. Echo, cast aside and sold for $1, entered Walter's life, not as a project, but as a mirror. In nursing Echo back to health, Walter was also tending to parts of himself that had long been left unattended. Each brush stroke, each whispered word, each bucket of water was an offering of trust. And trust, real trust, cannot be rushed. It must be earned over time through presence and patience. Mark's return added another layer to this story, transforming it from a man and his horsetail into something even deeper, a reconciliation between father and son. Mark didn't return with apologies. He returned with tools, with willingness, and with an open heart. Together, they did not dig up the past to rehash it. They simply began again, brick by quiet brick, day by quiet day. In Echo's progress, they found a language they could share. In his strength, they rediscovered their own. The Spring County Horse Show wasn't the culmination of this story, it was a symbol. Echo didn't need to win to be victorious. Simply stepping into the ring was a triumph of will, trust, and love. What began in a dusty auction ring ended not in glory, but in grace. And in the final image, Mark riding across the Montana hills with Echo at his side, and Walter receiving that handwritten letter, we are reminded that healing is not a destination. It is a commitment. It is choosing each day to stay open when it would be easier to close. To forgive when forgetting seems safer. The life lesson here is clear. No matter how far we drift, how broken we feel, or how silent our pasts have become, there is always a way back. Not to what was, but to what could be. Trust, like recovery, begins with a small step. And sometimes the hand that reaches out is covered in dirt or age or regret, but it's still enough. Because what heals us isn't perfection, it's presence. In today's world filled with distractions, disconnection, and noise, Walter's story reminds us to return to the simple things, to notice what's in front of us, to show up for the people, creatures, and pieces of our lives that still matter, and most importantly, to believe even when it's hard that it's not too late. If this story moved you, reminded you of something you've lost, or something you still hope to find, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to continue bringing powerful, heartfelt stories like this one to life. There's more ahead. Stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what it means to be human. Subscribe now and let's keep riding this trail together.